Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host today, Chelsey Youman, and I'm so excited to be with you. Thank you for listening in. We've got a really stellar show lined up for you guys today. Joining us today will be Liberty McArtor. She is a freelance writer in the great state of Texas, where she lives with her husband and now 2 sons. She's recently new to the man-on-man coverage that 2 children require. So welcome to the studio, Liberty.
Thank you, Chelsey. I'm glad to be here today.
So glad that you're joining us. A little bit later in the show, we'll also be joined by Richard Lim. He's a writer, a speaker, a blogger, and also producer of the podcast, This American President. He always has a great perspective for us and a wealth of knowledge for us to draw from. So be sure to stay with us for the next hour as well. We're going to start today's show talking a little bit about really how the pandemic is continuing to just wreak destruction on our school systems and our children. We have some news coming out of Chicago that students are returning to school for the first time after their union, teachers union, and the city finally agreed on what to do about COVID. And that's something we'll see replicated throughout the country. We'll also be talking in the show about this astounding, to me it was a very shocking study that the New York Times did on really how inaccurate prenatal testing results are. And we know a lot of people utilize prenatal testing to diagnose rare disorders or diseases. But of course, that leads to a higher increase in abortions. And so we're going to talk about that today. Benjamin Watson, formerly with the Saints and the Patriots, and NFL star who has really become an incredible speaker on behalf of preborn children and life. He works with Human Coalition, which is my organization, but he also published what I thought was a very insightful article about if we really want to have a culture that values life and values children in the womb, it begins at home and with parenting. And then, of course, next hour, we'll turn to a little bit more political topics. So before we get there, Liberty, let's start with Chicago. Chicago students were out of school for multiple weeks because the teachers union and city officials could not decide what to do over COVID-19 mitigation measures. They were in a dispute where the teachers wanted to ask for remote work, and so instead the school district just canceled classes for a week. Now, this is the 3rd largest school district in the country. LA is the 2nd largest. In LA, what the precaution measures they've decided to implement include testing every single student. All the students are vaccinated already. And then they also have a lot of remote work. And so what we're seeing is this pattern where everyone was pushed to get a vaccine that wasn't tried or true. It isn't working, I would say, on this demographic because they're younger demographics. So, they're less at risk anyways for some of these, comorbidity factors, for instance. But in general, students are still staying home. And, what really stuck out to me about this article, Liberty, is that this teacher said, or a teacher who in the school district who is also a mom whose students go to schools in these school districts in Chicago, said it's been frustrating. We sit at home healthy, waiting to be in the classroom. And she really acknowledged how dangerous it is outside the classroom for these students, especially in the region of Chicago. She said abuse, hunger, and lack of heat and violence are things that families in Chicago are really struggling with. And so, Liberty, I just wanted to start here and get, your initial thoughts when you read this article. We're all grappling with an ongoing pandemic, heading into year 2 in the next few months. the decisions we need for our kids and the science and, you know, kind of finally catching up with all these policies that policymakers are putting in place. And what were your initial thoughts when you read it?
Well, I'm glad that students are being able to return to school there. Kids have been in and out of school across the country since, like you said, almost 2 years ago in 2020. And I think it's important for people to remember not all of these kids, in fact, a lot of them do not have a supportive two-parent home in which they can sit and do remote learning or have somebody basically homeschool them while they're not able to be in a classroom with their teachers. And so for many of these students, in addition to just problems, you know, if there's poverty or abusive situations at home, they're just not learning. And so if you go 2 years with kids being in and out of school and not having the consistency that they need or the instruction that they need from a teacher, they're falling behind. And not only that, we've seen mental health crises skyrocket among children, including, middle school age children, even as young as elementary school children, because their whole world has been upended. And again, as you mentioned, we know that children are at the lowest risk for serious disease from COVID. And so we are forcing them to really change their life the most, because I think for a lot of adults, you know, they've been able to go back to work one way or another. But for kids, their daily routine is still being disrupted in a lot of places, and they're at the lowest risk. And we know that they're being harmed in other ways by being forced to stay home. And so any way that you can get kids to go back into school, I think that should be the priority. And I think that that is evidenced even greater by the fact that you're now seeing bipartisan support of this. Many people, regardless of their political affiliations or what they initially thought about the pandemic, are saying, no, we need to get kids back in school.
I think you raised some really interesting points, Liberty, and one of those being that really this isn't the same pandemic that it was 2 years ago, and I think it's time for school systems to catch up with that. You know, we're seeing the CDC as recently as the last few weeks cutting quarantine down from 14 to 10 to now 5 days. Mm-hmm. The virus has adapted, people have adapted, science and medicine has adapted, and it's time for schools not to be the lag behind for that, because, you know, we're all passionate about our children and their education and being in safe environments and wholesome environments. And we also, what we've learned, in addition to what we've learned about this virus over the last 2 years, is really the devastating impact that it's had on our kids and their socialization and their mental health and being at home. And who bears the brunt of that, you know, is the mom in the home who stays home with them and juggles. You know, one of the moms in this article specifically said we were given no notice. So we all had to cancel our jobs for a week. Some are taking unpaid leave. It's just a really detrimental impact for what you alluded to, which is a virus that for children, at least, we know they're doing okay with it. And for teachers, there are precautions that they're looking at and measures they're looking at. I think they're wanting to test 10% of the student body weekly, which for me, I'm not even sure how that would prevent the virus from spreading, only 10%. You know, so it's really some interesting policies that they're coming up with, but we're just continuing to see these negative implications, and our children are the ones suffering. And I'd like to see them do what so many other school districts have done, which is just open up and have in-person learning and learn to live within this pandemic. What about you?
Right. I mean, you know, there are so many options available now that we didn't have 2 years ago. We didn't know what COVID was going to do. It was a different time. Now we have multiple vaccines for people who want them. And I think there is evidence that for especially, you know, certain cohorts that are at a higher risk, they do offer protection. People can wear masks if they choose. I know at least in my town, I see schools are open. A lot of students don't wear masks to school, but, you know, some parents prefer that their kids do wear them. They don't have to, but there are also more treatments available for COVID now. So it's not the same risk that it was before, because for people who choose to take them, there are more safety precautions that you can take and more options available.
Yes, you're absolutely right. We're going to go to one of those breaks, but before then, we'll get back and talk about some of the Democratic policies and maybe the impact that will have.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Many Americans are being influenced by what can be called the woke movement. It is essential that Christians think through the implications of this attempt to restructure society under the guise of fighting oppression and injustice. Noelle Murring is the author of the book Awake, Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. She was on my radio program recently to talk about the tactics being used to promote woke ideology. For example, we're not defined in the image of God, but to the evil in society. You're merely one entity and a group identity rather than a person made in the image and likeness of God. You aren't praised or criticized for your actions and attitudes. Instead, you are elevated or condemned based on your group, your racial background, or your gender. The book begins with some necessary chapters on the origins of critical theory and the way these ideas came to America and then spread to society. Then she focuses on 4 important dogmas: group over person, will over reason, power over authority, and crowd and the victim. Then she explains how we have been indoctrinated into the ideas of woke ideology through the sexual revolution and through thought and speech control. And of course, so much of this indoctrination has come through educational activism. She concludes with important chapters on restoration. That includes restoration of the person and restoration of the family. We should not only stand up against the woke movement, but we should also be working to rebuild the foundational elements of a Christian society. If you want to understand what the woke movement is and how to respond to it biblically, this is the book you need to read. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I want to turn to Richard now and ask you this. You know, we've been talking in this segment about the detrimental impact that closing public schools has had on our students, but also the fact that they're still responding to COVID and the current variants like they did 2 years ago. And we know that, you know, medicine and science have told us that we can adapt just like the virus. And one thing that really stood out to me about this article is a little bit about the political implications that Democrat policies have continued to have. We know Mayor Lighthouse there in Chicago. The rest of the country, she is a Democrat. You know, she's been very widely criticized for decreasing their police force, the increase of violence in their cities. Murder rate is at historic highs. We're talking a dozen people a weekend, at times more, being murdered. You know, and now she's the one leading this initiative of shutting down the schools. And I would think at some point in the home, you know, even a family that might align with Democrat Party platforms and might align with their policies would start to really feel the detriment of certain of these policies, especially on the school front, where they're having to take off work, where maybe they can't afford to do that, and stay home and make sure their kids are learning, if they're able to do that. Otherwise, their kids are on the streets. You know, that's really a lot of a burden to put on the family. And I'm wondering, Richard, from a political standpoint, what your response was when you read the article.
Yes. Well, you know, it's one of those things where I think it shows just how out of touch the Democratic Party is, and it shows you really which what part of their party that they are catering to. They're catering to a part of their party that essentially wants the state to have a larger say in the way people raise their kids, the way education is done. And so I think that essentially when you have something like that, the party is really not thinking politically or strategically. They're thinking of satisfying their own base. They're thinking of satisfying this utopian side of their base that doesn't want to let any kind of crisis go to waste. And that's exactly what they're doing here. And unfortunately, I think that, if on the road to utopia, essentially you can't really have any obstacles. And that's how they're treating the situation.
Right. And I do think, though, Richard, that it's going to backfire. I mean, if you look at some of the elections that have already happened, like over in Virginia, the school policies and the school district policies were at the forefront of that election, and it became a really winning issue for the Republican Governor Youngkin, who ran there, to really hone in on, I think, what impacts voters the most in their home. It's their children. It's how their families are faring. It's things like inflation, which we'll be talking about in this show. And I'm wondering if that will ever be a wake-up call because, speaking to some of my relatives, my husband's side of the family is from Chicago, and they're moving out because people are being held at gunpoint constantly in their streets and in their neighborhoods. They've all known someone impacted by the rampant violence there, and even those who may not be impacted by violence, certainly in the third largest school district in America, they're going to be impacted by Democrat policies in their schools with their children. And so I certainly hope that this is a little bit of a wake-up call for people who maybe unfortunately are being a little disillusioned by these utopian policies or ideals that you stated, Richard, that in implementation, people can be harmed by them. One thing I wanted to turn and talk to you about while we have you, Richard, is this idea. I saw this article. It's going to be posted on pointofview.net for any of you who are listening and want to read up more on what we're discussing or more. This one might get your attention. It's Hillary Clinton's 2024 election comeback. It's the comeback we're all waiting for, right? Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have become unpopular, the article states. It may be time for a change in candidacy. And the author of this article says that there are several circumstances that we should take into account when we're thinking about the future of the Democrat Party. And they mentioned that President Biden has a low approval rating. He will be 82 years old when he runs for re-election in the next few years. And I think we're already seeing, some of the impacts of his health and age now in office. Kamala Harris is just incredibly, deeply unpopular. There's no doubt about it there. And there's no real strong Democrat to lead the ticket. So one of the article says one of the things they're considering is who is going to fill that vacuum, have name recognition, and is Hillary Clinton that person? Richard, go.
Sure. So it's a sign of how bad things have gotten, not just for Biden and Harris, but quite frankly, for how shallow the talent pool is in the Democratic Party. I think they tried to float around Pete Buttigieg's name. I have my friends who are Democrats. One of my friends is a Democrat, and he's gay, and he hates Pete Buttigieg. Like, he basically looks at him as just a candidate who the Democrats are trying to throw out there to get, a lazy way to get the gay vote in America. People see through that. If Hillary Clinton is your alternative, she's going to be, first of all, she's going to be 77 in 2024. As you said, Biden will be 82. And this article, the best line in it, and it's done by somebody who works for Bill Clinton, or at least did business for him. But the article calls her the change candidate, which is about as, I can't imagine, in what planet is Hillary Clinton, the most establishment candidate in American history, a change candidate? Just to throw in some history here, only 4 Americans have lost the presidency in a general election and then won afterwards. Those 4, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Grover Cleveland, and Richard Nixon. So it's happened once in the last 100+ years that a losing general election candidate would win the presidency. And of those 3, none of them had run twice before losing, just like Hillary Clinton. So historically, it's hasn't really happened that often in American history. And I hope they run her just for the entertainment value.
I do too. Liberty, I'm not sure what your thoughts were when you read that, but I, was really struck by the thought that the Democrats need to find something to run for, some policies that they're in favor of that can resonate with the American people. Do you think Hillary can be the beacon of their party?
I don't know. Like, I agree with Richard. The title of change candidate made me laugh because Hillary Clinton has been around forever, and I thought we were, with Biden, supposed to be getting new blood, and now he's not very popular, so they're going back to Hillary Clinton. And then they also tried to make her out to be, some moderate who was going to appeal to a broad base, and I was thinking, I'm pretty sure she was floating some pretty extreme policy proposals when she was running in 2020. So I think they do need new blood. I think, like you said, something to fight for. They're trying to with many of their politicians, appeal to a very, very progressive, extreme base to the left. And it's just not appealing to the average American.
I think when we're thinking about the next election, it is still a few years off, although I know several candidates get their feelers out early. And midterms are expected to be a really interesting guidepost for directions we should go. But, the Democrats spent the last 4 years identifying their entire party as the anti-Trump party. And so there's no doubt without Trump, there's a bit of an identity crisis there. What is it that we are about? And so far, it's been a lot of big business and a lot of spending. And we're beginning to feel the implications of that. On the next segment, we'll definitely be talking about inflation. But for now, just thinking about the future of the Democrat Party, there's even a big chasm within the party itself. I know that I read an article a few weeks ago that said that the left, based on the last 20 and 50-year trends, is far more extreme left than the right went right over the last few years. The right has some semblance of moderation based on the issues around this polling. And the left is further extreme than the right has become. And so I wonder, there are many articles coming out about dissatisfied Democrats. Where do I go? I used to align with their platforms, but as Richard said earlier, they're so far out of touch. Can the Republican Party mobilize on this and really become a party that welcomes others in? And is now the time for that, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that. You're seeing one of the big reasons Biden's poll numbers are collapsing is because he's losing the Hispanic vote. A lot of, I think, women in the suburbs are taking a second look at the Democratic Party because they're not pushing for policies that favor them in any way. And so I think as a result of that, and I think this is a sign of just how out of touch you have Joe Biden, who's been in politics for 40, 50 years, whatever it is. And so I think it's an inevitable result of just really what happens when the establishment just is left to its own devices.
Yes, it's certainly something that I would think Republicans should mobilize around, saying, look, we can own education. School choice is something that anyone can get behind. There's all these platforms and issues that they can own. It's certainly an opportunity. And when we get back after the break, we're going to talk about inflation and how that could be an opportunity for growth here in the future. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this break.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to Point of View. Today is the Millennial Roundtable, and I'm your host, Chelsey Youman. I'm joined today by a couple of incredible millennials, some of my favorite people. We have Liberty McArtor and Richard Lim. So thanks, guys, for joining me today.
It's great to be
good
here.
to be here.
Yes, well, we've talked a little bit about the show, about how COVID is continuing to impact school districts in some Democrat communities. We talked about Chicago and LA, and then broader a little bit about, the future of the Democrat Party. And now that we're seeing a lot more really disenchanted and frustrations arising out of people who formerly associated themselves as Democrats, and, where do they have to go in a two-party system where they maybe don't align with Republican platforms, but are certainly starting to see how detrimental the left's platforms can impact them. And so now we're going to turn and talk about consumer prices and inflation, some things trends we're seeing happening in the economy. Don't forget, you can go and read any of these topics or more on pointofview.net. And you can also go to Facebook, go to Point of View Radio on Facebook. You can like us and watch us and listen to us there. But now we're going to turn to inflation, because I think it's something that Americans are starting to feel. And that is because the U.S. consumer prices have soared 7% in the last year. And that is the most since 1982. So they take the percentage of inflation. It's not, across the board, and they say that includes rising costs for food, gas, rent, and other necessities that's increasing financial pressure on American households. And they had several things that they accounted for inflation, one of those being clogged ports and warehouses, exacerbated supply chain shortages of semiconductors and other parts. And then they also said that they attributed gas prices raising and surging because Americans have driven more in the last few recent months than they were previously during the pandemic. So, Liberty, I want to start with you. There's really a lot out here to dissect, and I realize I'm not an economist. I'm not sure if you are, Liberty, in your freelance work as a writer, but I'd love to get your perspective on these trends we're seeing and how they're impacting us as Americans.
Well, I am not an economist, but I do find these really interesting. I mean, I've noticed just the other day we went to grab some sandwiches and noticed, oh my goodness, it's more expensive than it was the last time. But it really is impacting everybody. And one thing that I think is interesting, we just got new approval ratings for this quarter for President Biden, and they're down to 33% from 36%, which was already a historic low back in November. And the top reason cited by people responding to these surveys saying that they disapprove of the administration is the economy. And another thing I thought was interesting, and this is from the polls back in November, but again, if the trends are, maintaining, then this is still true today. The people with the highest disapproval rating of Biden are those with a yearly income less than $75,000. So people who are on the lower end of the earning spectrum, they're feeling these changes the most in their day-to-day life. And so I think that's really interesting to see that this is affecting how people are viewing the presidential administration. These are the concerns that are the top of their mind and really making a big impact in their life.
That's an interesting point you raise, Liberty, that, it's the middleman and then the lower income households that are going to be predominantly impacted by this or feel it the most. And I think that's true of a lot of Democrat policies. We saw the same become true of, small business owners and family-owned businesses throughout the pandemic. The ones being shut down for days on end or not allowed to have customers in person. Or now, in certain cities where they're having to have vaccine passports to have customers come in. I mean, the people that feel the results of these policies, it's not the wealthiest in our country. Richard, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's also very ironic considering that the Biden administration's response is to immediately play class warfare and blame the business owners for the increased costs, which is just, something that they've done since FDR. One thing I want to say is that we're seeing the result of, as you said, a delicate supply chain, rising energy costs, and the fact that people have been staying at home, they can't travel, they finally have more disposable income, and as a result of that, there is too much money chasing around too few goods. And I think the one thing that we really want to avoid is a situation where wages and prices just spiral ever higher. People are demanding higher wages. As that happens, it's going to drive up prices. They're demanding higher wages to keep up with the prices, and with higher wages, it's just going to drive production costs even higher. And that's something that we want to avoid, and we certainly want the Fed and the Biden administration to do everything that they can to stop it. The problem is that we have an administration that, from what they've been saying, it sounds like they're either in denial about the issue, indifferent, or they're just going to blame businesses for raising prices. And so much of the economy and so much of how things, the businesses grow is based on the psychology of the consumer and the investor. And if you're getting these kind of mixed signals of indifference or contempt by the administration, that's just not going to help the situation.
I think it's interesting you point that out, because I was looking at some of the things they were blaming. They said they were blaming the business person and supply chain issues. And it's really difficult when you're looking at how much the big government is spending, and potential increases in taxes. Do you think their solution is that they said at the end of this article, one of their solutions will be potentially 3 increases in interest rates. So that's going to impact any loans you have, housing, mortgage loans, car loans, anything like that. Is that something that's a great way to kind of quell what you're describing as the inconsistent increasing in prices, or is that going to just slow consumer spending into the economy?
Well, it definitely will slow consumer spending. I mean, the Fed really has 2 different options. They can raise interest rates to cool down the economy and cool down inflation. That's what Reagan did. Reagan and Volcker did in the 80s. They can also try to take money out of the economy. There are different ways that they can do that. The way to do that, though, is you have to plan it very carefully. You have to give enough time for people to adjust to that in order to maintain the same kind of economic activity. And again, it's so much about signaling. It's so much about whether the Biden administration will signal a sense of cooperation with the nation's business owners. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that. This is one of these issues that I remember reading in history books about how throughout the 70s and early 80s, inflation was really rampant. I mean, you had double-digit inflation. This was a problem that really destroyed Ford and Carter's presidencies. And I've always observed that our generation, anyone born in the 80s and 90s, we really haven't had to deal with inflation. And, I'd read about it in the books. Wars were started because of, economic crises and inflation. And we haven't had that problem. Unfortunately, we're seeing it now. And we have about the least effective administration to deal with that.
It's true that you mentioned that, because I'm racking my brain going back through my political science background and thinking, I just don't know as much about inflation. But Liberty, I'm thinking here that one of the polls showed that inflation has now replaced the pandemic as the number one concern of Americans. And, what does that kind of say about how much American people care about this? I'm sitting here thinking, cancel culture only goes so far, and like the cultural side of the dialogue we see in the public realm is one that you can afford to have if your children are being educated well and you're able to afford food and gas, but when it comes down to these basic necessities being what feels like threatened or becoming a cause for concern, all of a sudden it matters a little bit less, what are all the cultural trends right now, and it comes down to the bottom line for each family.
Yeah, and nothing really matters if you can't go about your daily life. So if you can't even, if you're losing the ability to have the freedom to move around, to be able to get supplies you need. I mean, I know I've heard lots of stories in certain parts of the country where baby supplies are in high demand and short supply. And so there are a lot of things that people are struggling with on a day-to-day basis. And at the beginning of the pandemic and at the beginning of Biden's presidency, that was a high concern. It was new. We were trying to figure it out. But another thing I was reading about approval ratings today, people initially were approving of Biden's response to the pandemic, and now that's flip-flopped because I think people realize, okay, we have the vaccines, we have more treatments now, we understand more about this virus, let's get on with our daily life and cope as we need to, but we need to get on with it, and that's just not happening because of a lot of these Democratic policies being forced on people around the nation.
Well, that's an interesting point. When we get back after this short break, we're going to continue to discuss just the impact of the economy is having on the American people, and we would love to hear from you as well. So don't go anywhere, and don't forget, you can go to pointofview.net and read these articles and more. Stay tuned.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to Point of View. Today is the Millennial Roundtable, and we are just unpacking, different trends we're seeing come across our country. But I'm going to turn now to something happening overseas that I wasn't aware of until I saw this article and thought maybe you guys would be interested in hearing a little more about it. It's been reported on BBC.com that Ukraine tensions are on the rise because Russian forces have moved 100,000 troops towards right across the Ukrainian border, prompting fears of an invasion. And this is something I'm not seeing reported a lot in the United States. But of course, on Point of View, we love to discuss news that isn't at the forefront, but something we want you to be aware of and know that's out there. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the background on this. NATO, Ukraine would like to become a part of NATO. Ukraine, it's a part of their constitution even that they would join NATO. And with increasing, I guess, geographically close nations wanting to join NATO, Russia is feeling threatened. And because of that, they moved 100,000 troops across the border. And then they sent a list of demands to NATO, including that Ukraine can never join. I think that they view it as kind of a proxy war of sorts. The United States has responded. Our Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, warned that Russia must choose either diplomacy or a confrontation with the West. So I'm going to start with you, Richard. I know that in 2014, Russia also made these types of moves. They overtook portions of Ukraine even after Ukraine elected an official who was not as favorable towards the Russians, and because of that, they took over parts of it. I think Russia typically makes these moves when Obama and Biden are in the administration, but we're definitely see them make an aggressive play here in this proxy war.
Yeah, well, to be fair, Putin is somebody that will act when an opportunity presents itself, and so it was during the Bush administration he actually invaded Georgia, and there's basically a long history here of Russia eyeing Ukrainian territory. I mean, for so much of history, Ukraine was under Russia, and Russians looked at Ukraine as basically, well, you know, they're basically they've been a part of Russia for a long time during the Cold War. Actually, during World War War II. When the Soviet Union signed an agreement with the Nazis, it basically allowed them to take over all of Ukraine. Now, there are a lot of people in the United States who look at it from a very realist perspective, and essentially they say, well, Russia is just trying to establish a sphere of influence. It's kind of like how the United States established the sphere of influence with the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. And I think one thing I think it's important to remember is that, well, what's the history? Why do people in places like Ukraine resist Russian rule? And the reason is because Russian rule has rule from Moscow, whether it was under the Soviet Union or Russia, has not always been a very good rule. And you can look at it in the 1930s when Stalin's regime from Moscow created a horrible famine, Holodomor, that killed about 3 million Ukrainians. And so when you look at it from that perspective, there's a reason why people in Ukraine don't want to be under a Russian regime. Now, here's the thing. The Ukrainian government is they're not good guys either. I mean, the Ukrainian government is one of the most corrupt governments in the world. And so really you kind of have two situations, two parties that are not really savory characters. There are not a lot of heroes here in terms of the leadership that's going on. But I've always felt that it was important to bring out that perspective beyond just the realist politics of the whole situation. Also, it is clear, even though Putin will take any advantage he can in any kind of situation, America right now has weak leadership, and there's a lot of internal division. I think that it's telling that you had Wendy Sherman, who's the media touted as, quote-unquote, talking tough to Putin, and then this morning we find out that Russia is threatening to send forces to Venezuela and Cuba in response to American support for Ukraine. And it's almost like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 happening all over again, and they're threatening to stick forces in America's backyard. So clearly Wendy's threats really scared the crap out of Putin.
Well, I think she really touted her ability to have diplomacy, and she talked about how incredible diplomacy they'd had. But then I realized she was talking about within NATO. They're all allies. Of course, diplomacy is working great among NATO countries who don't want to see Russia give them a list of demands, which they flatly rejected. They rejected all the demands. But Russia is making, in my view, some aggressive statements. They even went so far as to say that, and they're not talking about just this proxy war with Ukraine. They're talking about European more largely in these quotes that they're saying. But they're saying that there could be quote unquote unpredicted consequences for European security. I mean, in my mind, that's a threat to Europe. And the NATO secretary also acknowledged a real risk for new armed conflict in Europe. And that kind of got my attention, Richard. I thought maybe this goes beyond the typical, back and forth we've seen between Ukraine and Russia over the last few years. And with, as you mentioned this morning, the moving of the troops to our backyard, is Russia attempting are they just talking big, or could they be making some more aggressive actual conflict maneuvers here?
Well, and you just have to look at the history. I mean, Vladimir Putin is not afraid to use force when necessary, whether it was in Georgia, whether it was in the Crimea in 2014. Another thing to also remember is that no matter how tough the talk gets or how many statements NATO releases, so much of Europe is dependent upon Russia for energy, essentially. And so right now we're seeing Germany is actually making a decision on a pipeline that goes through, that basically provides them energy from Russia. And so that's a great deal of leverage that the Russians have. And in the end, that's what's really going to talk. Russia, they're not afraid of shutting down energy as leverage over their neighbors. And last time I looked, I think Germany, 40% of their energy does come from Russia. So that's, in the end, I think it's it shows really the delusion in the Biden administration that somehow diplomacy can change the interests or the incentives that Russia has right now. Right now, the only incentives that really influence what Russia will do is the relative strength of the United States, and under Biden, that's relatively low.
Liberty, I would love to get your input now on what we've discussed today and this escalating situation.
Well, I am not a foreign policy expert, and so I've been enjoying listening to Richard and learning a lot right now. But I will say, just more as a journalist and someone who, reads and researches things, I thought it was interesting that, again, in the approval ratings that we just got, looking at the Biden administration, a foreign policy is cited as the top three things that Americans currently disapprove of, how the administration is handling. And so you might think, for people who aren't, typically reading about foreign policy, that this isn't something atop people's minds. But I think a lot of people are looking at the news and they're saying, okay, we want to make sure we have someone strong at the helm, and they're not really approving of that right now. And so I think it's really interesting to see, how this plays out and realize that the American people are watching.
Yes, the American people are, I hope, watching, because there's so much going on. I mean, we have a pandemic. We have to put our own food on the table. As we've talked about this hour, it's, kind of been an hour of the direction it feels like things are going. But we always say, we thank God we're a democracy. And as, Christians and believers, our hope is not in this world, but we certainly are called to be a part of it and engage with it and not shy away from it. So thanks for listening to us this hour. Thanks for being with us, Richard. I'm going to continue on with Liberty after this quick break, so please don't go anywhere. We have many more great topics to cover.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, hello, I'm Chelsey Youman, your guest host today for Point of View, and I am hosting the Millennial Roundtable. It's a day that I love because I get to speak to fellow millennials about current events through our Christian perspective, of course, and everything going on. I am joined by Liberty McArtor. She is a freelance writer and a recent mother of two. Welcome, Liberty. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here with you, Chelsey.
Well, we have breaking news. This was not on our list to cover. As you know, we post all of our articles we've discussed last hour and over the next hour on pointofview.net. So feel free to listen back or go to the website and read up on all the topics we've discussed. But we have breaking news out of the Supreme Court, so we're going to just talk about that now instead. The Supreme Court ruled about 30 minutes ago to block Biden's COVID vaccine mandate for businesses, but allow it for healthcare workers. This is a huge ruling, and one that I know so many of you have been waiting on and listening for, because if you work for a company or a business of over 100 people, then you have been told, no doubt by your employer, that you either have to get vaccinated or come to work wearing a mask and get a negative COVID test weekly. OSHA issued those regulations set to go into effect in January this month. And it has been something that I know has been incredibly burdensome and worrisome, not just for you and me or anyone involved in those environments, but also for our employers or my group. For instance, I work with Human Coalition, and we're a nonprofit organization with over 100 employees. So you either face exorbitant fines or the concern that your employment force might be depleted. People will go look for employment elsewhere where there aren't these, burdensome regulations on them. But today, the Supreme Court blocked that mandate. And so you can breathe a sigh of relief, at least for now. That mandate was challenged, as background, by 27 states. So all the Republican attorney generals or governors, essentially, a bunch of private businesses, religious organizations and groups like First Liberty Institute, the National Retail Federation, the Trucking Association, and the Independent Business Federation all challenged this mandate for being an overreach. And today, Liberty, we just saw that the Supreme Court agreed in a 6-3 conservative majority. They expressed deep skepticism about the federal government's move in the majority opinion, saying that while, yes, Congress has indisputably given OSHA the power to regulate occupational dangers, it's not given that agency the broad power to regulate public health more broadly. And so essentially they thought this was an overreach by OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They did limit this ruling, though. So if you are a healthcare worker, they said that the vaccination requirement would still apply to you, because in a more narrow sense, that was not without OSHA's reach to say in a pandemic that healthcare workers working day in and day out in the environment should be regulated. But essentially, the court held that requiring the vaccination of 84 million Americans selected simply because they work for employers with more than 100 employees certainly falls outside the purview, I would say, of or the bounds of their authority. Liberty, I know that this is breaking news, but what have been your thoughts about this vaccine mandate for employers, and then today the ruling that blocked it?
Well, it's always exciting to get breaking news when you're on the air. And so this is fun to talk about, but I think it is a good decision that the OSHA vaccine mandate has been blocked, because regardless of what you personally think about the vaccine, that's just the thing. It should be your personal choice, whether or not you decide to get it. And so it's great that it's available for people who want it. But once you start forcing people to get something, then that's where you're in very dangerous territory. And so just think of the precedent this would have set if the Supreme Court had said that the federal government could basically just reach their hand into every, large company in the United States saying, here's what you have to do for your employees. Today it's the vaccine mandate, tomorrow what? And so I'm very thankful that they blocked it because this really at its core, again, regardless of what you think about the vaccines, this is an overreach issue. And the Supreme Court has said that in this case with individual organizations and companies, the administration cannot force them to tell their employees that they have to get a vaccine.
You're really hitting on a few important points here. So I'm going to highlight a few things that you're saying that I think are so important for us to really wrap our heads around. First, this mandate is the most expansive use of federal power maybe ever, to individually impact every American. We're talking about 84 million Americans being told to be vaccinated. That's an incredible overreach for this pandemic, obviously. But once you give the federal government power, it's not like it limits itself and says, okay, I've had enough of your rights. I'm done. No, federal government at its core, it's power hungry, and it's constantly seeking to have more and more input into our lives, and has in increasing rates over the last few years. And so I think, it's important that the Supreme Court's role is, in fact, in some ways the last stopgap before these types of incredible overreaches occur. And then the second thing I would pull out from what you said, which is, OSHA is an administrative body. So this is a federal government agency. That means the high levels, they're appointed by the presidential administration in power, and that can turn over every 4 years. But these are unelected officials. The rest are career, what they call themselves in D.C., career politicals. They work for an agency, and they are not elected officials making these really incredible asks of the American people and of American businesses. And so I appreciate that the Supreme Court appeared. I have not read the opinion, just these certain excerpts, but that they appeared to say, look, Congress has a duty here and Congress can act. They're elected officials. It's their responsibility if they see fit to make these kinds of rules. And so I really liked seeing that limiting, that's real democratic separation of powers in play. But the administrative state, this is one example, y'all, of thousands and thousands of how the administrative state is delegated incredible amount of authority over our lives. Right, Liberty?
Right. And I really like how you brought up the point about the separation of powers. If anybody, has kids in school that are learning about our constitutional setup here in the United States, this is a great example of, this is a check and a balance of, you have an administrative body, like you said, doing this, and then this is where the Supreme Court comes in and says, no, you can't do that. And then in that way it protects our freedom. But that's really interesting, just the way that you frame it and how many Americans, because we think big companies, but in reality, 100 people is not that many people. So the majority of Americans that go to work somewhere would have been affected by this. And so that's just unprecedented federal overreach, like you said. And so it's really good that it was blocked.
Yes, and not to mention our businesses have been taxed enough by this pandemic. At what point does the federal government won't view it this way? We talked a little bit earlier on the show about inflation and really how combative the Biden administration came out against local businesses and saying that, really inflation is their fault and supply chain problems. It'll be curious to see how they respond. When we get back, we're going to talk more about the Supreme Court decision and then move on and talk about one of my favorite topics, life.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Many
Americans are being influenced by what can be called the woke movement. It is essential that Christians think through the implications of this attempt to restructure society under the guise of fighting oppression and injustice. Noelle Murring is the author of the book Awake, Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. She was on my radio program recently to talk about the tactics being used to promote woke ideology. For example, we're not defined in the image of God, but to the evil in society. You're merely one entity in a group identity rather than a person made in the image and likeness of God. You aren't praised or criticized for your actions and attitudes. Instead, you are elevated or condemned based on your group, your racial background, or your gender. The book begins with some necessary chapters on the origins of critical theory and the way these ideas came to America and then spread to society. Then she focuses on 4 important dogmas: group over person, will over reason, power over authority, and crowd and the victim. Then she explains how we have been indoctrinated into the ideas of woke ideology through the sexual revolution and through thought and speech control. And of course, so much of this indoctrination has come through educational activism. She concludes with important chapters on restoration. That includes restoration of the person and restoration of the family. We should not only stand up against the woke movement, but we should also be working to rebuild the foundational elements of a Christian society. If you want to understand what the woke movement is and how to respond to it biblically, this is the book you need to read. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable. Liberty McArtor and I are discussing this breaking news out of the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court did say that OSHA's vaccine mandate for any employer or employee, I should say, that works for someone with 100 other people, that they should be required to be vaccinated or undergo consistent COVID testing. That mandate has been overturned by the Supreme Court unless you're a healthcare worker. And so we're talking a little bit here, Liberty, about really how difficult the path over the last few years has been for American businessmen. But earlier on the show, last segment, where all of you can go back and listen, or you can go to pointofview.net and read our articles about inflation, we were talking about the posture and response of our current administration, the Biden administration, being to be really combative towards the businessman. And they said, look, inflation, it's corporate America's fault for inflation. They're buying too much, and there's supply chain issues, and really put that off on the American people. And I think that's an incredibly important point to hone in on, because now we're also seeing the burden continue to be expected of the American people and the American businessman of this pandemic. Instead of the federal government doing what I would like to personally see about the pandemic, which is increasing, medical research and trying out drugs that have already been approved and exist and are treating the virus. Why do we have 3 vaccine options only for treatment, where we hear stories of doctors being told they can't prescribe anything else to treat it? Why aren't there more antibody test treatment centers opening up, which is what Governor DeSantis did in Florida? There are still, really incredibly long lines everywhere to get a test even. So certainly there are ways that the federal government can combat a pandemic without expecting and asking more of American businessmen, like asking them to close down, for instance, or to only allow patronage by people who have an identification card. Not to mention the fact that you should have a basic identification card to vote, but that's considered racist by the left. But getting a vaccine card to enter a business to go to dinner, that's not too much to ask. So, I'm sitting here and I've been frustrated about this vaccine mandate. So maybe this is just my moment to shine that the Supreme Court has vindicated the American people and the American businessman. But I just think it was such an incredible thing for them to ask. And as I look at our nonprofit, who is run on charitable donations, and, to see the impact that that's had internally and the turmoil that people have faced, I know that's not alone for us. That's for many people out there who are saying, do I have to take a COVID test every day or go get vaccinated if you have an objection to it? So, Liberty, I don't know if any of that resonates with you, especially with your work experience. But I think today it's kind of an insightful thing that we've seen OSHA, issue this mandate and ask yet more of American businesses, but B, incredibly grateful for the Supreme Court and the role that they play in protecting the rights of the American people from unelected officials who make mandates for them.
Right. Well, we shouldn't be too surprised that the federal government isn't, the best entity to handle a crisis. But this is just another example in the pandemic of misplaced resources. I was actually reading a few days ago this really fascinating article in Real Clear Science. It was by a doctor named Buzz Hollander. And if you like data, and people have been saying, follow the science, follow the data. If you like that, this article is full of it. And he talks about how kind of like the idea of the weekly testing, for these companies that would have had to implement weekly testing for people who aren't vaccinated. That's kind of a waste of resources, because if you get tested at the beginning of the week, you could still get COVID a few days later and spread it to a whole bunch of people. But there are people who need to get tested who are sick, and there's a shortage of tests. They're having to wait in lines for hours and hours. How come we don't have an easier way for people to quickly get tested and see if they have COVID yet? And again, with the vaccine mandate, healthy, younger, healthy populations who aren't at high risk for COVID or don't have, the high multiple comorbidities that make it more dangerous. Maybe they don't need to get vaccinated. Maybe forcing them to get the vaccine isn't smart. Maybe we should be trying to make the vaccine and other treatments more accessible to people who are really at a high risk for it. So I think this is almost, you could say, just an example of the federal government or OSHA as a federal agency flexing its muscles, saying we can make you do this. And look at us. We're trying to do something to solve the pandemic, but it really isn't making any sense.
It isn't. I mean, did any of our employers ask us on our vaccine status for any other viruses, or, did our mumps and measles vaccines? No, we didn't have to report any of that. It's kind of an egregious HIPAA violation for the employer to have that information on you, but also to think through, the position that, and from my religious liberty background, it put employers in the position of potentially exorbitant amount of fees and lawsuits, because now you have people who maybe can't get vaccinated but still have to get tested. That's a disability. If they have a medical condition and they can't get vaccinated, they could sue for disability discrimination. Or if you have a religious objection to obtaining the vaccine and now your employer is, maybe doesn't know better, but is delving into your religious conscience questions, they're susceptible to a religious liberty lawsuit, an employment discrimination lawsuit. So I think it's far better for the federal government to, if they want to help in the pandemic, there's a lot of ways they can do that without this, person-to-person mandate. So we can leave it there, but I just wanted to make sure everybody listening knew that news came out. I know that's going to have huge impacts on our employers, our businesses, our lives, and us as employees. So no doubt that 84 million Americans are paying attention who would have been impacted by that mandate. I'm going to shift gears here now, because a dear friend and colleague of mine named Benjamin Watson, if that name rings a bell, it's because he is a very famous NFL superstar, but he's also an incredible Christian, a believer, and very, very pro-life. And he is, he works with my organization, Human Coalition, as the vice president of strategic affairs. And he came out with this article, Liberty, that I thought was really a great piece. It was really a piece that I, as a young mom, and you probably as a young mom, maybe other millennials who are now majority parents, I believe, could take note of. And so it's entitled this: Want a Pro-Life Culture? Start talking to your kids about sex. And he just dove right in and said, look, we don't have a culture that respects life, but we also, in my view, I would add to that, we don't have a culture that respects marriage. We don't have a culture that respects traditional family. It's a culture of, there's no hard and fast rules here. There's no truth. It's a completely relativistic culture. And so because of that, we don't see a culture that necessarily, I do think the more pro-life generations are up and coming and people are understanding it, because with those lies of the relativist culture that there shouldn't be anything as marriage, cohabitation is great. Eventually truth rises to the surface. And in the case of life, that means science and medicine confirm what we know to be true, which is a child in the womb is a human being and who is alive. And because of that, they're worthy of protection and have dignity. But one way, besides politically, to, I think, engage culture on the life issue is exactly what Benjamin is saying here, which is talking to our children about everything that involves life, about sex and God's design and the biblical design for it, and having his perspective on it. So, Liberty, I was going to start by just saying, we as millennials can speak to how we really grew up. I don't know if you agree with this, but being in the Bible Belt, our churches didn't really talk much about any of the hard issues, marriage, the LGBT thing. They didn't talk about any of that. There was an abstinence, like I would say, trend in the Christian movement in the 90s, when we were growing up. The purity culture, yes, that was very big, but it wasn't necessarily... there wasn't a lot of biblical teaching about these difficult subjects, which of course is our parents' role. And we as parents, have to own that. But the church, I think, engaging in some of these issues in different ways, we're now seeing the church go the other way. And after being in a firestorm for the last few years for Christian biblical beliefs on marriage and sex, we're starting to see the church speak to those issues. But what do you think maybe the result is of the purity culture in the Christian movement, or just, a failure to talk about it on the issue of life?
Well, I love the idea of parents needing to be more open about talking about sex with their kids from a young age. And I had never thought about it, though, and framing it from a pro-life perspective, but that makes so much sense, because we do want to teach our children from the beginning that, yes, we are sexual beings. God created sex. That's good. Here's the purpose of it, and here's how life begins, and we must value life from the very beginning. And so I think this is a great article, just a great perspective on it. And one of the things we need to do as parents is make sure we're giving our kids a good foundation and education about the issues that matter.
It's so true. When we get back, we're going to continue this discussion about how we as young millennials try to shape the future generations. No pressure, but stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host today, Chelsey Youman, and I'm joined at the roundtable by Liberty McArtor. We have been discussing an article Benjamin Watson wrote that talked about if we want a pro-life culture and future generations to respect life, that training really begins at home. And it begins with having sometimes awkward or embarrassing or taboo conversations with our children about sex and what the Bible has to say about it. You can read this article on pointofview.net, and don't forget to go to Point of View Radio on Facebook if you'd like to watch or like our page and listen to us there, learn more. But I'm going to continue with this conversation because we kind of been talking about as millennials, you know, that topic was often taboo, even among Christian circles, the topic of what the Bible has to say about human sexuality. But that maybe that led to people, because they don't have the healthiest biblical viewpoints on that, you know, we really have seen a hypersexualized culture. And now we as millennial parents are looking at a culture years later where there's these vacuums in place that will teach our children if we don't. And Benjamin Watson talks about those things like pornography, the internet, looking to movies and Hollywood. And there are so many ways that if we don't teach our children, somebody else will. Right, Liberty?
So true. And I think that's such an important point because, you know, in the past, I think we mentioned the purity culture earlier and kind of in the 90s when we were growing up, I think that came out of a good place. Our parents wanted to protect us from a lot of the false teachings out there and the dangers. But in this day and age, we have to recognize, as much as we don't like it, we really can't completely protect our children from worldly teachings and worldly values. For instance, studies show that kids will see hardcore pornography for the first time between the ages of 9 and 11 years old. And so the technology is ubiquitous. Smartphones are everywhere. Even if you think my kid is in a safe environment at a Christian school or in Sunday school, it just takes one kid with a smartphone saying, oh my gosh, look what I found. What is this? And now everybody's been exposed to it. And so if you don't want to be in that position to where your 9, 10, 11-year-old comes to you and is like, oh my gosh, mom, you know, if they come to you and this is what I've seen and have had a conversation with them about sex from a biblical perspective first. And so I think that's another thing we have to think about is it might seem really young, but we're actually equipping them to be able to deal with the world that they will inevitably encounter when we talk to them about these things, even from a young age.
Yes, it's that idea of what you said, equipping instead of protecting. My husband and I say that all the time about our children. We have 3 boys, and it's really intimidating in a culture where everybody is going to have a cell phone around them or computers around them. You know, we can protect them from those things and have rules in our own home. But like you mentioned, it's just a matter of time before they're eventually exposed to something, and to have them equipped for how to handle that. You know, it is really intimidating. And I, as a mom, am constantly, you know, researching and trying to figure out what those discussions are. But I think we have an incredible resource in the Bible. You know, God has a lot to say about the topic and his design for it. He created it after all. And it's something that, you know, I think Focus on the Family has some resources as well if you're out there listening to this. And I think they even say things like starting earlier and younger, because we also live in a world with more predators than there have ever been. And so making sure that your children, even from younger ages, know how to identify, you know, different parts of their body and know that it's theirs to protect, and teaching them what bodily autonomy is for themselves. That's really scary, hard things, but things that I think are important. But as it relates to life, it goes part and parcel with God designed part of that to include the ability to procreate and the ability to create life. And he knits that together in the womb. I was even reading in Job this week, and Job's a rough book, but for whatever reason, my year-long Bible study, we're in Job already. So, but he was talking about how God, he put those formations of us together before time began. You know, he knew who we were going to be. And so that's all part of the talk about human sexuality with our children is the beauty of God's design for life and parenting and creation. And, you know, I love that Benjamin Watson brought that to the surface. He even shared some funny stories that I won't share on air, but you can go look up if you want to hear some funny personal stories of Benjamin Watson. When their children, they're so innocent and they ask funny questions, and they don't have the like warped worldly views or shame or embarrassment or whatever that feeling kind of comes to the surface when you talk about it. Kids don't have that. They're innocent and fresh, and to allow them to engage with them on their level in their innocence and not attribute, our own mess with it, I think was something really that was wise that he shared. So that's what stood out to me about that, Liberty. Did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think that, the way that we can talk about this is to just really frame the topics of sex and procreating in terms of just selfless love, because kids actually from a very early age, they ask us questions about where babies come from. A lot, they have a little baby sibling, and little kids love babies, and they're like, what is this thing? Where did it come from? And so the opportunities to start talking about that present themselves very early on, and I think we can just use that to lay a foundation of, selfless love and family relationship the way that the Bible wants it to be, saying that, yes, this is a product of people who made a commitment to each other. And, we value this life. It was created out of love. It is our job to protect this life from the very beginning. Here's how it develops. You remember when, your baby brother was in mommy's tummy? There's just so many wonderful ways that we can use this conversation to really give them a good foundation of valuing life from the beginning and framing it in terms of love, which is what we really are trying to do as a pro-life movement.
It's so true. I mean, Liberty, from one mom to another, do you have any resources that you recommend for other millennial parents listening right now who kind of want to book up a little bit on how to have these topics and what's age appropriate?
Oh, well, the Focus on the Family that you mentioned, I know they have good resources, but another book, just because we were mentioning purity culture earlier, and so it kind of relates because it just talks about these conversations that we should be having. A great book is Talking Back to Purity Culture by Rachel Joy Welcher, and she really she's a pastor's wife, a pastor's daughter. She comes at this from a place of loving the church, being completely dedicated to biblical teaching, and just how we can develop what she calls a better biblical sexual ethic and just understanding of how to talk about this and how to teach about it in church. And so that's a great book. It just came out a year or two ago that I would recommend.
Thank you for sharing that. I love having, Christian resources to turn to, because guess who is in this field if the Christians are not? Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood has an entire sex ed curriculum that they've instituted in many, many, many public schools. In the state of California, they have a pilot program where the school nurse is a Planned Parenthood nurse. And so just to be on guard that this is not something that there's just a vacuum out there if you don't deal with it. The truth is, there are people on the other side who have a financial and interest in abortion and in free sex and all the things that come with that, and in warping our children's minds. And so to be on guard, to be aware, but also to resource yourself. I think as a mom, that's, my goal is to try to do. We're going to keep on the subject, though, of abortion here, but not entirely in the vein of abortion. A New York Times article came out that surprised me, because when I first saw it, I did not assume that it was New York Times that did it. But it's an article about when they do prenatal testing on women. So when you're pregnant now, you go to your doctor. They immediately ask at 10 and 12 weeks, do you want to get prenatal testing to look for rare genetic disorders or screen for other type of chromosomal issues? It's something that at every single pregnancy, every single woman is asked by her doctor, and it's a very casual conversation. It's just, do you want to find out if there's anything? Oh, and you'll find out the gender too, which is really how they got, me in my third pregnancy. I was very excited to find out if I was ever going to have a girl, which I didn't. I love my son Wilder, but very much a boy family. And so they kind of just get you in with this testing, and it turns into, if you do get a negative result, for many people out there, a really terrible time. And so what New York Times did was a very deep study, actual journalism, people, and they went in and found that between 85 and 95% of these genetic tests come back inaccurate and tell women inaccurately that they're going to have a child with Down syndrome, or sometimes fatal abnormalities, children that they won't live beyond a week if they live to birth. Really horrific, scary things that women are facing. And then, many of those women go on to terminate their pregnancies under these false guides where, further testing would confirm that there's actually nothing wrong with their children. Liberty, I'm going to give you just a minute here. What did you initially think?
Well, I think that it's really promoting this false notion of control. New York Times was talking about these companies that say, hey, for, with just a little bit of your blood, we can predict your baby's health, basically. And of course, that's not true, but it just promotes this false idea that we're in control of their genetic future.
Interesting. When we get back, I want to hear more on that, Liberty, after this break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome to Point of View. I am Chelsey Youman. I'm here with Liberty McArtor, and we are really talking about this kind of phenomenon over the last few years that have been happening with a vast increase in genetic testing for women who are pregnant. And they just take a blood sample. And New York Times did a deep dive where they showed that between 85 and 95% of results that tell women their child has a disorder, whether that's anything from Down syndrome to something where that could even be a fatal disorder, those tests are wrong and they're coming back wrong. And Liberty, I love the point before the break that you were making that it gives us this false idea that we control our health outcomes with genetic testing. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. And as somebody who has a 7-month-old right now, this is all very in recent memory for me. And, early on in your pregnancy, you go in and they give you several brochures. And like you said, you can also find out the gender. So it is tempting. And basically, as New York Times pointed out, these companies in their brochures and their literature will say, this is accurate, and not actually put their numbers on there, which show that most of the tests are inaccurate, especially for these very, rare genetic conditions. And so it's misleading women from the beginning, but I think it's misleading women on a deeper level. Just this idea that, what's the premise there? Like if you say, okay, find out if there's anything wrong with your baby, for pro-life people, we'd say it doesn't matter. But for a lot of other people, the implication is if you get a result that says there is something wrong, okay, well, now you can terminate your baby, or, maybe you don't want to have this baby. And so it's kind of giving you this false sense of like, well, this is our chance to make sure we're going to have the perfectly healthy child, rather than just accepting the human life that you're being given. And so I think that a lot of people might not be thinking of it in those terms, but that's what the underlying issue here is, that we want to make sure that we're selecting the desirable babies to have. And it is tragic because a lot of these women have gone on and terminated their pregnancies because they got a false result that there was some sort of rare condition. But then even that itself is tragic because so they thought there was something wrong with their baby, so they decided to end the pregnancy. And now it's like, oh, well, I found out it was going to be healthy after all. And it's kind of this idea of babies as a commodity. And, you can read stories about how there's certain places that are trying to make babies in labs and combine just the right genes to get these super babies or whatever. And that might seem kind of out there to people, but this is kind of how you get there. And, are we willing to care for babies with disabilities? What if there is somebody who's born and they don't have a long life expectancy? And now as a society, we're saying, well, you might as well just kill it now, instead of valuing that life for what it is. And so I think that's the issue here that we need to address as a culture.
It's true. And the root of what you're saying is really, we have to acknowledge this. It's a big word, but I'm going to say it. It's a eugenicist root. It's a root that is based in eugenics, which is, that the strongest survive and the rest don't. And if we can't have our perfect child, then, we want the option to opt out. And we know that God created each human with a purpose and a design for a purpose, and that each of his creations is beautifully and wonderfully made. But you have the other side where, it's, for me, I always say abortion is the last frontier where discrimination is accepted. Because what that really is, it's discrimination. And in certain countries like Sweden, Finland, Iceland, a lot of these, some of those nations on the northern side of the European continent, they actually brag now that their Down syndrome birth rate is 0. And we know that that's because they're eradicating children with Down syndrome. And so it's truly devastating, I think, how culture and the world looks at it. But for me, I read this article with almost a different take, Liberty. But, last I'll say, it's surprising to me that New York Times went there and acknowledged, like, how sad and difficult. They had examples of women who had aborted their children and found out a few weeks later that the test results were wrong after getting further testing. And, for me, for New York Times to acknowledge, well, in an instance of misunderstanding or misinformation, that abortion is a tragedy. I can only hope for the hearts and minds of others who read it to say, well, maybe in other instances, abortion is also a tragedy. So, really, I can see some roots taking place there. When I read the article, that's just me. But, we can certainly be praying for some of these hearts and minds as truth rises to the surface about these issues. But the second frustrating thing to me was kind of the consumer fraud part of this, that they are not forthright about how accurate the testing results are to doctors or women. So the doctors providing the tests don't always know. The women certainly don't know. And it's, for me, another example. I mean, I'm going to rag on Big Pharma here, where we've seen them. They should be taking a big reputation hit right now. They're not regulated. These tests are not regulated at all. FDA considered regulating them and then chose not to. Otherwise, they would be required to disclose a lot more information. And because they're not regulated, they don't have to say all that completely unless you decide to sue them for consumer protection, which is an option. But truthfully, these companies, the first tests are a few $100s. And then as they misdiagnose and women want to continue with more invasive testing, those can ramp up to $1,600, $2,000. And so it's another instance for me of Big Pharma really taking advantage of the consumer. And there's, not a lot of oversight there.
Exactly.
Did that stick out to you, Liberty?
It did. I think there was one example of a woman who said something like, $1,200 later, she finally got a test that showed her initial result was wrong and that her unborn baby was healthy. And so it's really sad, and it is upsetting that they are taking advantage of people in a vulnerable situation, pregnant women, people who are wanting to have children and expecting children, and then giving these false promises of kind of being able to control the outcome and making sure that you have a healthy baby. And then, with these highly inaccurate tests saying, here's something for you to worry about. You better throw more money at it. And it's really just a big ripoff. and it's sad that it's taking advantage of women in yet another way by the medical establishment.
It is. And, women often go into the genetic testing to give, full picture here. Sometimes women just say, I want to be able to prepare, right? You go get tested. You want to be able to say, I have 9 months here to prepare for whatever the scenario is, not understanding how truly rare the genetic disorders that the panel accounts for is. And, so all that to say, I just wanted to put this out there because I think the more people know, I'm telling all my friends who are in their birthing years here, if you're going to do the genetic testing, take it with a grain of salt and know what it is and know how inaccurate it is. And it should never be a basis, as we mentioned, like life matters. And it should never be a basis for those decisions. But it really is, interesting to see some of these numbers starting to come out. And I certainly hope that the answer is more regulation yet again on big pharma. And I mean that in the sense, conservatives don't typically say they like regulation, but in these areas we're seeing where they're boxing out, especially think of the COVID example, they're boxing out alternative medical treatments in order to have this one prevail. Those are scenarios that I think we should allow real competition in the marketplace. But in this instance, it would be more like consumer awareness and transparency. It's always a good thing.
Exactly. And that's what we advocate for in the pro-life community, is for women to have all the information so that they can make real choices.
It's so true. I'll say a little bit about my organization now. So I work with Human Coalition, and we're an organization that serves women in need who are seeking abortion every single day, in the hopes that if we can meet them and serve them where they're at, we can rescue their children and save lives. And that's done through ways like just having them know that there are resources and answers out there for them. It's very driven towards the woman and designed for her. So if she needs a job or safe housing or is facing, domestic abuse or violence at home, we come in and say, let's fix those circumstances in the hopes that she'll choose life. Well, thank you for being with us, Liberty McArtor. Again, she's a freelance writer, and you can go to pointofview.net and read her bio and contact her. It has been a pleasure to be with you today, and I hope you'll stay tuned next time we're here. My name is Chelsey Youman, and it's been an honor to be with you today.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.